I'm going to be sharing some acrylic painting tips to help you make your acrylic paintings look more realistic. Today's video is sponsored by Frederick's Canvases. I am working on a watercolor canvas board. Now these canvases, you may think just for watercolor, but they're not. They work great for acrylics. I like them for when I'm getting really super fine detail, or if I'm going to be doing a lot of airbrushing like I did on the background of this piece. Before we get started, if you are interested in more in-depth tutorials, make sure to head over to Patreon, where I've got almost 4 hours of real time on this video alone for you to follow along with. If you are unfamiliar with Patreon, for as little as $4 a month, you get access to all of my longer weekly tutorials that range anywhere usually between 1 and 2 to 3 hours each. There are over 200 for you to watch right now as soon as you sign up. If you are unsure if Patreon is going to be a fit for you, head over to my website. I will have a link to all of this in the video description, where you can watch a free 2-hour colored pencil demonstration. You can also see my entire library of all of the videos that I have available now. For this one, I started by painting my background canvas a lavender color, and then I used tracing paper and transfer paper, white transfer paper, to transfer my drawing onto my canvas. I'd rather draw this way than drawing directly on the canvas, just because this way I don't end up with eraser marks. Any erasing marks are done on my tracing paper separately, and now everything is kept nice and clean. Then I went ahead and started airbrushing the background. You saw I used a stencil to get my circles, and then started airbrushing color over it. And this works very much like a glaze. The airbrush colors that I'm using over those circles are pretty translucent, so I can keep that shape of the circles, but now tint the color. It's a lot easier than if I were to start by just trying to airbrush the circles all of the colors that I wanted the end result to be. This is a far easier way to get this look. Don't worry, for those of you who are not interested in airbrush, I'm only airbrushing the background. You can paint your background however you like. I do have a video showing you how to get a similar look with acrylics without an airbrush, and I'll have a card pop up so you can check that out. Now on to the rest of the subject. One of the most important things you want to keep in mind when painting with acrylics, or really any paint, this isn't a paint by number. Now, there's nothing wrong with paint by number, but that is not the look we're going for here. We want to build up layers so that everything has a much more realistic feel. If you try to do something in a sort of paint by number way, meaning just put the right color in the right place, you end up with a finished piece that, while it looks pretty cool from a distance, up close, it almost has a plastic-like feel. You don't have the softness that you would get when you let one color overlap another. Now, I do like glazing a lot. One, I think it makes everything a lot easier, and two, I love the end result. What happens when you glaze, when you put one translucent color over another, the more glazes that you do, the more layers that you do, the light refracts through each of those layers. So when you see that painting in person, it has a lot more depth than if everything were opaque colors, just like I mentioned before, putting the right color in the right place. So I'm building up the texture in the horns here, and notice how light they are right now. That's okay. I'm gonna glaze another color over it. What I'm trying to do is just build up so I have that texture. And when I use the term texture, I mean visual texture, not physical. If you touch my canvas, it's completely smooth all over the place. There is no clump of paint at any point sticking out. And again, you can see this is super pale, way too light, but now look, when I glaze brown over it, look at what a difference that made to tone that down. So when it smoothed everything out a lot. So my lines, my brush strokes weren't quite as harsh. When you glaze over it, it does tone that down a bit. But the other thing is that now I've corrected the color, but I didn't have to worry about mixing the perfect color for the horns as I was working, building up the texture at the same time. I think it simplifies things, because when you work in that initial layer, all I was really focused on is building that texture, getting the details in there. I didn't have to worry about the color being perfect. I fixed that later. And you'll see me do this as I work through here. Watch as I start painting these little bits of fur. I don't need them to be perfect. I'm just gonna paint them with white on top of where I painted the inside of the ear there. And then I can glaze. I will let that white dry all the way, and that's very important. Make sure when you are glazing that your first layer completely dry before you glaze over it. Otherwise, you will lift the first layer. Well, not the first layer. I guess that's not the right way to word that. The previous layer. Any layer that's completely dry, that shouldn't lift if you're using a quality paint. And here I am using Liquitex Basics, and I know people always get on me about that because it's listed as a student grade paint. I like it because it's perfect for glazing. It is light fast, it is archival. No, it's no lesser than the heavy body or the soft body paints, but it tends to be more translucent, which I love because of the way that I like to glaze and layer. So it's just a good fit for me. I mean, bonus points for it being more inexpensive, but that's not the reason that I choose it. And we're going to let that dry. We'll come over to this ear. Now, a big tip for you when you are trying to paint things more realistic, don't look at your subject as a whole. I'm not looking at the entire animal. I'm looking at the one little area I'm working on. So in this case, the ear. And you may find it easier to work even smaller than this. Just break it down to maybe 1 or 2 square inches. Focus on your reference photo and look at the shapes and shadows. So one of the things that happens when people are getting started and they're trying to create things that look very realistic, you're looking at the animal as a whole. In this case, your brain's like, okay, I saw the photo. I know what it looks like. I've got this. And you stop looking at the photo. You don't spend enough time looking at the photo. You should be spending more time looking at your reference than you do your actual painting if you're trying to make things look more realistic. And by breaking it down into one small zone at a time, it makes it easier to pay attention to all of the little details. Those details get very overwhelming, and if you're new to painting, they're going to be even more so for you now. Don't worry, that does get better with time. The more you paint, the less overwhelming that will feel. But breaking it down into these little zones. So in this one, you saw I started with the horns, then I moved onto one ear, and then the next ear. Now that doesn't mean I can't go back and make adjustments to any of those. You absolutely can. You're unlimited for how many layers you can do. But I do want to just focus on one small area at a time so that it doesn't become overwhelming, that I can just pay attention to the shapes and shadows that are in that reference photo. Another tip, if you are struggling to make things look realistic, your brain is kind of trying to take over and say, I've got this. I know what an ear looks like. We don't need to look at the photo. Work upside down. Flip your artwork and flip your reference photo upside down. You will notice so many things that you didn't notice before. Moving on to the eye, I've switched over to a liner brush. This one is a synthetic hog-haired liner brush. I believe that one's a number 2. If you struggle to get fine detail and to get your liner brushes to work how you want, I do have a video showing you how best to use those. I'll have a card pop up so you can check that out. And the eyes are like everything else. You want to look at the reference photo and pay attention to your shapes and shadows. Don't let your brain try to override your eyes. Make sure you're copying what you see there. Where are the lights? Where are the darks? Look at it as shapes and shadows, not as an eye. And don't be afraid of getting high contrast. One of the biggest mistakes that I think a lot of people, especially me, when I first started painting, I was definitely guilty of this. We're afraid to get our darks dark enough. Usually our lights are okay, but the darks dark enough is the scary thing. It seems like you're gonna mess things up if it's too dark. Worst case scenario, it's too dark, paint over it. It's not that big of a deal. Acrylics are a very forgiving medium. Don't be afraid of going too dark. But if you are afraid, if your work has a tendency to kind of have that mid-range color, that it's not super striking, your darks aren't very dark, your lights aren't very light, take a photo of the work when you think it's finished into any photo app. You can use it on your phone or do that on your phone and adjust the contrast. Hype up the contrast and look at how much better it will usually look. That can make all the difference in the world in your work. And then when you see what that looks like in the photo, it may give you the courage you need to go ahead and make those adjustments on your artwork. Make your darks darker. Now, don't be tempted to make those adjustments in your photo editing apps and post that online and misrepresent what your actual painting looks like. I've seen artists do that. You see the painting in person, it's like, wow, you took some liberties with that photo app, didn't you? You want your photos of your artwork to be very, very close representations, as accurate as possible to your actual paintings. But using that tool just so you can see what it would look like if you hyped up the contrast, so now you can be brave enough to go make those adjustments on your own painting, very, very helpful. Using the liner brush again here to get some of the details. This guy's tongue is sticking out. He was chewing on some grass. My next tip for you, white is very rarely actually white. You do not need to use as much white as you think you will. You may use it to lighten up a color, but be careful when you're painting something white. In this case, you look at his chin and you go, okay, it's white, just paint it white. If you do that, you just paint it white. Now it's flat. it doesn't look right. Look at the shadows in there. Look at the purples and the peaches and really pay attention to that on your reference photo. A white rose. You're not going to use as much white as you would think. You want to keep white for your brightest highlights. If you paint the whole thing white, that's as bright as you can get it to go. You can't make your highlights brighter. So that means you need to make sure your shadows are dark enough, and your reference photo, assuming it's not overexposed, should show that. It's usually going to pick up colors that are in the background. So in this case, the purples. The green would be an option. I usually won't pick up green or pull green into my subject if I do have a lot of the green in the background. So here, I'm going to play out the purples instead. I think that looks better than the green would, but I do have purples in the background, so that works. Another tip, if you do what I do and you like to change the background on your subject, make sure whatever colors you use in your background, you pull into the subject itself. So in this case, I've got the green, which, as I mentioned, I don't really like pulling green into the subject too much, but I've also got a lot of lavenders. And so that lavender color I can pull into the subject, and you can see that all over the front of his face here. There is a lot in the black, and the black is very similar to white in that you're not going to leave it just black. Look at all of the coloration there. When you see this guy in person, you would look at him and go, okay, that part of his face is just black, but it's not. Look, it's mostly purples and blues. There's not a lot of actual black in there. So now I'm just going to block in the next section. I'm not worrying about details here. I just want to get a base color. Let that dry, and then I can move on to the next section. So that's not done, obviously. That's just me letting it dry while I work on this. These are my, like kind of an underpainting. I'm mapping out approximately where my lights and darks are going to go. My next tip for you on making your work look more realistic, stop putting so much importance on the color that you choose. The color matters. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but it probably doesn't matter as much as you think it does. Your values matter the most. If you want your work to look more realistic, the main challenge most artists have is getting their darks dark enough, their lights light enough. Pay attention to your values. I could paint this guy, well, heck, I painted him with a whole bunch of purple. That's not super accurate, but it looks realistic still because my values are there. Darks dark enough, lights light enough. That is going to give your work a lot more depth. Help you to make him look more realistic. A great example of that years ago, I was hired to come in and fix a mural that someone had painted on the wall it was a nighttime scene with camels. And the drawing was accurate, but they were unhappy with the result the other artist had done because it looked very cartoony. The artist drew it fine. Didn't do the shadows. They didn't pay any attention to values. They just painted the animals almost solid. There was very little shading. All I had to that didn't come out right. All I had to do is come through with an airbrush. It was super easy, had it done in about a day, came through with an airbrush and added the shadows. The lights were light enough. I just had to get the shadows. They were thrilled because that's the look they were going for. They wanted it to look more three-dimensional, and all I had to do was hype up the contrast in the shadows. Super easy for me, and they were thrilled with it. But that alone will make such a difference in your work looking realistic. A tip on making your work look a bit more three-dimensional here. You can see I've got the hindquarters of this guy. They're slightly out of focus. You want to pay attention, again, to your reference photo, or even if it's not a reference photo, you could be painting from a live model, but pay attention to which edges should be harsh versus which ones should be soft. When I first started painting, I thought every single brushstroke I made should be harsh and clean, and it didn't look realistic. You want to pay attention to what is really in focus, and in this case, that is going to be his face and his ears, his horns, and then as he fades out in the back, that line is very soft. I mean, you can see where his body is separate from the background, but it's not a harsh line there like it is on his face or his horns. So as you look at your reference photo, ask yourself, is this a harsh line or a soft line? That's something you really want to start paying attention to. It'll make a huge difference in your work. Now, once I get everything pretty much finished, everything's blocked in, I'm gonna spend some extra time fussing over little details. Backing away from the work, take a break for 10 minutes, come back, take another break for 10 minutes, come back, but keep taking breaks and coming back and looking at what might make mine look better. So as you can see here, I'm going through and adjusting my values for the most part, making my darks a little darker where they should be, or lights a little lighter where those need to be. Glazing here, I hyped up my color saturation, I'm making up words, color saturation by pulling in those golden tones. It's really mostly orange. And what a difference that made, because pulling that in made the purples next to it stand out that much more. I didn't have to glaze a whole lot of purple or any extra purple than what was already there, but by pulling that orange right next to it, it made that purple stand out a lot more. Using the liner brush to get some of those whiskers in there. Coming back through with a few more highlights. And again, took another break, came back with fresh eyes, and I could see I wanted to make my brights a bit brighter. Don't be afraid to use that phone app to mess with your color saturation, or well, that too, color saturation and contrast, to see how much better your work might look if you made some adjustments. It really does give you a lot more courage when you see how great it could look if you made those changes. And usually at the very end of a painting, right before I'm completely finished with it, I will flip it upside down, at least at the end, to double check anything that I think might stand out a little too much that doesn't look quite right. I've pulled this pale blue, little bit of that highlight around his face, a little bit on his horns there. It gives him a bit of a glow. Helps him to look really shiny. Watch when you're painting animals that have black too. I talked about having the blues and the purples on the front of his face there. That's really important. Don't jump into just doing white as your highlight, which ends up being gray up against the black, because that will have a tendency to make the animal look very aged or dirty, dusty. Not usually the look you want to go for. If you want to make black look really shiny for your highlights, and this would be the same whether it be people with black hair or very dark hair, animals with black fur, anything black, if you want to make that look shiny, use blues and purples, violets, any colors like that. Use that on your highlights, and you can paint the highlight in white, but when it dries, glaze a little bit of blue or a little bit of purple over it, and it will make that subject look like that fur or hair in that whatever your subject is, look so much more shiny. I went to Aqua Studios Aquariums last week to get more salt water so I could do a water change on my fish tank. Look at all these beautiful corals. I was being so self-restraining. I wasn't going to get any of them until Corey showed me a new batch of mushrooms. Mushrooms are my favorite, by the way, that came in, and bagged one up, sent me home with it. There's a fish tank I also really am considering saving up for my clownfish. Look how pretty it is. That one's 30 gallons. I'm debating between that one and a 40 gallon. I don't know. You guys let me know what you think. So I took my new mushroom home, and Gibson is going to help me acclimate this guy. I have to get his water temperature to match that of my tank. Yep, Gibson, that's where we're gonna put it. And I have to take water slowly from my tank and drip it into this cup. I'm using a high-tech device here. It's a turkey baster. We're just going to slowly drip. There are better ways you can do this, or easier ways, I should say. The end result's the same. I'm just dripping the water into that cup. We're gonna get the water chemistry to match so that I don't put this poor little mushroom into shock by putting him into different water. Gibson is quite interested in this whole process. No, Gibson, we don't need that cup yet. We're just gonna keep dripping. Once I was done with acclimating him here, we dipped him in some iodine, and then I was able to put him in my tank. This whole process takes me about 45 minutes to an hour. I just want to make sure mainly that the temperature and the salinity, those are the two things I'm checking as I go, that those two things match. And here he is in his new house. At least his new house until I eventually upgrade to a bigger tank, which I'm clearly running out of room because of my mushroom obsession here, and the green star polyps are growing fast. Have you subscribed yet? If not, I have a handy button right there. It's round, has an orange arrow going towards it. If you click on that, that'll help you to keep up to date with all of my new art videos every single week.